in the West, like, I think really the problem, and I'm going to say, like, it's a certain absence of a Leninist analysis in a way, because what's amazing about Lenin was, again, like, when you look at the sheer complexity of the Russian society that he confronted, right? In terms of, like, the nouveau riche, like the old aristocracy, like a small urban working class, like, tributary peasants, like, well, it's just like, this, a liberal bourgeoisie, it's a very, very complex class structure. And if you look at the way that he intervened into that, right? And, even under the watchword, right, of working class hegemony, which, by the way, Gramsci did not invent, right? He defined it in his own way, but he wasn't the first to use the term. He's able to put together, right, all these diverse class interests. Mm-hmm. Well, how do we base a movement on the proletariat if the proletariat, is not the majority, right, or is not, decisive with respect to the totality of the population? And I think looking at Lenin can be very useful, right, in terms of how he deploys hegemony for understanding that. Mm.
All right. Greetings, friends and comrades. Daniel here with Conrad Hamilton, who is a Marxist philosopher and somebody who is, well, I like to think of him as the Marxist Canadian Jordan Peterson, the answer to Jordan Peterson for contemporary Marxists. People at Sublation like to call him a neo-Stalinist, but their definition of Stalinism is insanely broad and means nothing. I like to consider him a comrade. He's an interesting writer. He has a forthcoming book, which is entitled Marxism Contra Subjectivity, which I've had the chance to dig into, Conrad, and I find it quite compelling. I mean, one of the things that Conrad is interested in is epistemology, sort of what is Marxism's sort of theory of knowledge, and how, and this is one of the kind of merits of your work, you pay a particular attention to how Marxism and the crisis of Marxism after 2008, in a very like stark materialist historical conjuncture, is having to face all of our forefathers, like the Althusserian tradition, right, for example. Mm-hmm. And you really tether with traditions of Marxism that are theoretically very ornate, even Baroque, even like almost intimidating traditions. And I think your writing has a certain capacity to illuminate them in ways that are quite interesting. It should also be noted that Conrad wrote a review of my book on Nietzsche, which I felt very honest and refreshing. Also, Conrad had written an essay with Matt McManus on Nietzsche. So I don't know, maybe we could start with this, Conrad. I don't know that we share the exact sort of position on Nietzsche and Marxism, or the question of Nietzsche and the left, although there's a lot of overlaps in our positions.
So to be clear about the essay you mentioned, which was released in a collection called so it's wait,
The Politics of Aristocratic Radicalism, something like that.
Yeah, there Nietzsche. You go. Is that it? Yeah, The Politics of Aristocratic Radicalism. There you go.
It's kind of one of these texts that comes out. It's a collection of essays on, in the Anglo-Marxist world, socialist world, as I understand it, right? I've read many of these essays there. I think I actually endorsed the book from the publisher. They asked me to review it. How
do you know more about this than I do? Like,
no, because literally they reached out to me and said, would you give this your blessing? Do you think this is good enough to publish? And I'm like, yeah, this is excellent. But it's one of these books really having to do, I think, with where Marxism is at in the wake of the aristocratic rebel by Lacerda being translated in 2020. That's a big focus of the text.
Yeah, no,
Kind
definitely.
of a new appraisal of Nietzsche, right? Kind of bringing out this Lukácsian, seemingly forgotten critique of Nietzsche.
Yeah, I think that was kind of the idea, and obviously, well, yeah, touching on Lukács, but yeah, my essay for that, which was not written with Matt McManus, so he was the editor of the collection. It was called, I think, Recurrent Reaction, Nietzsche and the French middle strata. I think that's right. No, I mean, in essence, in that essay, which actually was interesting because it started out as a comparison between Mao and Deleuze, of all things, which I think could be profitable, but Matt objected that it wasn't sufficiently comparative, so I kind of went back and retooled the essay. And I think what we got out of that was this sort of notion that, to sort of paraphrase in some way the essay, that there had been an ascendant middle class in France, as in other countries, right, after World War II, because of the extensity of wealth redistribution, which had occurred in that time, which itself would not be extricable, right, from the legacy of class struggle. But that Nietzsche kind of is revived in this context. Of course, we could talk about like the receptions of this in France, which are intimately connected to Bataille, and I do discuss that in the essay, right? But Nietzsche is revived in this context and applied by a number of thinkers. Of course, we can talk about Derrida, Deleuze, and so forth, to furnish a kind of ideology that is between the defined poles of class struggle in terms of bourgeois and proletariat. But I think assumes a particular importance in the wake of the kind of Nietzschean critique, right, that we see in the 70s, right, with Lyotard and so forth. And I think it acquires a particular importance after May 68, right? Because it's in May 68 where you have this initial solidarity, right, between students and workers. And actually, May 68 was started at Nanterre in Paris, the university. And the original cause of May 68, because we often talk about May 68, but people talk less about the original cause, was I think it was restrictions in dorms about bringing over members of the opposite sex. And this had been a bit of a powder keg because of how repressive a lot of the Gaullist policies were, right? Like, France was not transforming at the same rate politically in terms of responding to these new liberal demands, right? That had been characteristic of, New Left and so forth in the 60s. So that broke out. And then there was this wave of sort of violence that was directed toward the Maoists that were kind of going through the Marais and the students and all of this. But then, of course, at some point, the French Communist Party called for an end, right, to May 68, and accepted an election as a means of resolving it, right? So a lot of the people who'd been involved as student leaders were very frustrated by this, right? And I think this, really exacerbated the theoretical tendency towards a kind of break with Marx, right? But that's interesting too, right? Because it kind of opens a new chapter, maybe, in the history of theory, in the history of Marxism. When you look at something like Anti-Oedipus and, Deleuze and Guattari, we don't always discuss this so much, but if you look at the way that they see capitalism as setting on desires that it's unable to contain, right? Because this is sort of the thesis of the book, and there's like all different kinds of thinkers that are yoked into it. But this is the basic idea, right? That there's going to be this sort of desire that overcomes itself. They oppose themselves, right, very strongly to any kind of third world socialist project, right? So much so that even Samir Amin, right, and I imagine you're at least somewhat familiar with Samir Amin. They talk about, because he had advanced the theory of delinking, right? The idea that if a third world country seeks to develop itself, that the best means for it to elevate its economy and its society, is to kind of de-link from the global world system, right? And this is based on a larger hypothesis that, it's not the case that poor countries are going to automatically rise up by opening up markets. Rather, it's the case that, the opening of markets is what the basis for their continued exploitation, right? But with respect to that kind of thesis, Deleuze and Guattari even, I think, characterized it at one point as a curious revival of the fascist economic solution, right? And the implications of that for the assessment of third world practice are, wide and potentially perturbing in their generality.
Right. So like desire for them, desire is not generated from lack. Desire is productive, but material productive socialist politics is fascistic, right? So it's not that there's like a homology there between desire as productive and some kind of celebration of because those forms of collective organization reproduce the Oedipal problematic, right? They're too molar, right? They're too molar. They're not they're not properly subversive. And so what you get is a new constitution, a new theory of class struggle that has left a logic of coherence of historical agency vis-a-vis class power into what they call the groupsicle or the micro turn to So
minor.
So perhaps the
ideology
exactly.
of marginality and difference. Yes.
Perhaps you could say something about how Nietzsche might fit into that. I mean, in a certain way, perhaps he's so central that we often miss how central he is. For Deleuze, I mean, you can see, the manifesto of nomad thought, which precedes by almost a decade Anti-Oedipus, which argues that Nietzsche is the preeminent thinker over Freud and Marx, and that the left is a countercultural left, and that Nietzsche's philosophy provides the inspiration for this type of ludic countercultural leftism, right? Which then I would then see Anti-Oedipus as the kind of attempt at formalizing that original Nietzschean impulse, right? But it's building off of that. I don't know how you would see that. I mean, this is part of the focus of your essay.
Yeah, I mean, I would see that as part and parcel of the larger ontological flattening that his work accomplishes, right? And I think Ray Brazier is really interesting about this, and he's actually drawing heavily from Branjam when he talks about it, which could be problematic in other respects. But I do think it's interesting with respect to Nietzsche. And he talks about how, in Kant, you have this kind of separation of reasons and causes, right? But how, the edifice of the will to power, right, kind of reunites those, right, into a kind of return of ontology, right? Because the enunciation, right, the rational explication, right, ceases to have independence from power as an ontological principle, right? And, this is the kind of ontological flattening through which Nietzsche will dismiss socialism, right? Because then it becomes, the promise of a kind of false transcendence, right? And it's precisely in a sense, Deleuze's gesture in this way, right? It's a kind of false Hegelian contradiction, right? I think they say at one point, nothing was ever killed by contradictions, right? So there has to be a kind of imminent traversal, right? You have to pardon me, I'm not a Deleuze scholar, right? So I wrote this essay a while ago, but there has to be a kind of imminent traversal, right? And it's exactly that sort of disposition that causes them to, talk about, and they quote from, I think, a fragment by Nietzsche when they talk about this, the will is strong, right? The, how we need to potentially accelerate the process, right? How there's been this kind of, grim sort of proletarian conformism in a way, right, that has been characteristic of the comportment or the structure, right, of socialist states. And if that is the alternative or pseudo-alternative, as the case may be, perhaps we just need to further heighten this kind of desire, right? But this links into a larger sociological trajectory, right? It's instructive when you look at something like Capital and Ideology by Thomas Piketty, which is, whatever his deficiencies, I think, like a great book. Because he has a term he uses called the Brahmin left, right? And it's basically used to characterize those people that, and I use this sometimes in my work, but it's basically used to characterize those people who are, to a large extent, the beneficiaries, right, from the same generation as Deleuze and Guattari, the beneficiaries of, the expansion of education, right, and the support it received from the state after World War II. But the tendency for those very people, who had accumulated wealth in many respects because of this opening up or this greater equalization, sort of kick the ladder away, right, at a later point, right, and support policies which were not conducive to enabling those same opportunities for another generation, right? So you can see it as part of a, it's not that these things aren't resources that we should draw on, because they're real dilemmas that they're responding to. Right. I mean, even if you look at, Deleuze and the way he's looking at, different economists like Schmidt and so forth with respect to finance capital. I mean, that, like that is a dilemma, right, that the left has to engage in. But I think you also have to understand that it's politics. It's part and parcel of the politics of a certain generation and period. And it does represent whatever its value, right, a kind of distancing, I think, from certain very integral principles of Marxism. Right. That were upheld by other people, that we don't read as much, but that we should, right? Like, it's like, it seems to me, and maybe it's just this part of the world, or maybe it's the discipline I've chosen, but it seems to me that Deleuze is more read than Samir Amin. But I mean, I think Amin, in terms of his thesis of delinking, which is, perhaps not even so adventurous insofar as there's a purely empirical aspect to what he's saying, like 200 million people out of poverty in the USSR, 800 million people out of poverty in China, right? Whatever the problems. Right, that's like a strong argument in that respect, but also the way that he attempts to develop like the category of the Asiatic mode of production, right? So into a more refined conception of the tributary mode of production, right? So the idea that the Asiatic mode of production is actually the historical norm, right? Whereas the other modes of production that Marx describes, like feudal and the antique mode of production, which is premised on slave owning, would be more characteristic of what we might term, perhaps a bit retrospectively, Western history, right?
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, Cybertine Blanc has a book which tries to make a defense that Anti-Oedipus, especially the third chapter on historicism, is an imminent critique of and dialogue that is rigorous and well-meaning with Marxist historical materialism. And so some contemporary scholars will say that one can read Anti-Oedipus in line with an imminent critique on the tradition of historical materialism in a similar way to Kohei Saito and degrowth communism trying to do the same thing. But ultimately, what I think in both instances they're trying to do is sort of fundamentally reshape core Marxist commitments. But this is nothing new in French philosophy at that time. I mean, I think the question is a sociological one, as you say, like why did Balibar completely, from a theoretical standpoint, almost obliterate the category of the dictatorship of proletariat, in his early 1970s essay, right? Why does Alain Badiou a little bit later...
Are you sure that's correct? Because I'm pretty sure that he defended, because there's the 1976 debates within the French Communist Party over because they were going to drop the category of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which was connected to the shift to Eurocommunism. And I'm pretty sure that he and Althusser defended that category at that time. Now, maybe we're both right that it was reconceived, but I'm surprised by what you're saying.
It was not. First of all, there's two things. One is I've read his essay on the dictatorship of proletariat from early 70s, and by no means did I get the impression that he's trying to retain it in line with French Communist Party. On the one hand. On the other hand, what his position on it has been since then is that he agrees with Poulantzas, who gives an even more thorough rebuke of it. So what I'm trying to say is that it is very common in French thought at the time to get on the inside of Marxist core concepts and perform a pretty significant 180 and overturning of them. Some of that needs to be kind of treated as, I think, like a scalpel, like what's good and what's bad about it. Take Badiou in Can Politics Be Thought, which is his most thorough redefining of Marxism.
Yeah.
There's a lot in there that is quite interesting. I mean, he's giving us a highly sophisticated, almost trans-historical theory of communist invariance. He's giving us a whole new theory of historicism, of what he calls periodicity. So there's like numerous innovations that come from the French moment, and I suppose that we've been living in the wake of all of those innovations. Deleuze and Guattari's are amongst the most seismic, if we choose to read. And of course, we know that Deleuze hints that he's going to write a book called The Grandeur of Marx that never is written. And I think that a lot of Deleuzean diehards will say, well, because Deleuze had some positive things in general to say about Marx, we can charitably read Deleuze as in line with Marxism, when what they fail to see is the radical extent to which this overturning of core Marxist principles is actually what's going on. So anyways, we don't need to spend too much time on that, but I want to actually return to Nietzsche for a moment and ask you, if I might, what is your assessment on the Lukácsian and the Laserdist critique of Nietzsche, right? I mean, in a certain sense, it's interesting because its historical arc is one that is determinately in Nietzsche's time. It's in Nietzsche's world, right? That's a kind of one of its core merits. Whereas the French Nietzscheans are radically ahistorical in that regard. What are the merits of the former, of the Lacerda-Lukács take on Nietzsche in your views, and even also what are the limitations of it in your view?
Well, I mean, and I should stress that, these are questions which are not completely easy for me to answer, but I will say that, I mean, I think that if we look at it historically, one of the interesting things is that, in a way, because if we look at who are the three major Nazi thinkers, or who are considered like the Titanic icons of Nazi, right? We have Chamberlain, right? Like, Anglo-German racial science, right? We have Wagner, right? And we have Nietzsche, right? Now, we can dispute the integrity of, the Nazi reading of Nietzsche, for sure. I mean, there were certainly shortcuts, and obviously, like, his latter-day revision of, his earlier anti-Semitism, becomes a serious issue. And one way that people get around this, right, which you're probably aware of, right, some of the Nazi thinkers like Rosenberg and so forth, is through a kind of historicization of it, right? So it's like, well, if he said that, Jews should be integrated, he was talking very specifically about this context, in the Second Reich, with Bismarck and all of that, right? But I mean, I think in a way, it's interesting after World War II because, in some sense, the Nazis lose. So obviously this, this, would-be empire that kind of, defined itself in some sense through a reading of his work, right, had failed, right? And it was a pretty spectacular failure, right? You look at Stalingrad, which was kind of this, stunning loss. Like, the Nazis wouldn't even say it in their media for weeks and weeks because they didn't know how to communicate the breadth of it to the public. And that actually, I don't want to digress, but actually would be an interesting event to look back on because, our tendency, in addition to, I think, in North American media receptions kind of downplaying it, is to see it as an inter-European war. And yet there's a sense in which Stalingrad would mark a decisive turn in the colonial struggle. Because, of course, the Slavs at that time were considered by the Nazis to be kind of sub-Aryan race, right? They were slated.
Well, that strikes me as very much in line with Lacerda's Stalin book in a certain way, which, as sort of Stalin as a prefigurative figure of post-war colonial of decolonization, right? As ushering that in somehow.
Yeah, well, and like, like whiteness is, a social construct, ultimately. So it's subject to a huge degree of variance, right? I'm not like an expert in these texts, but I'm not sure to what extent that would have been applied to Eastern Europe, right, by Western Europeans prior to Stalin's triumph at Stalingrad, right? So you could frame that as there's one way of framing it as an inter-European war. There's another way of framing it as a kind of intercolonial dispute in some way. So in a way, the Nazis lose, right? And they had been expounding Nietzsche, some reading of Nietzsche. And you might think that the result of this would be that, throughout the West, Nietzsche would be comprehensively discredited, right? Like that would be one outcome you could imagine would arise. But in fact, something quite different happens, right? Which is that, if anything, what you see is that, when it becomes clear that there's going to be certain difficulties cooperating with the Soviets, right, which we see, right, in terms of the division of Germany, right, its partition and all of that, which is beginning to happen, right, as early as like 47, right, some of these tensions. What you see is that, there's this tremendous pressure placed on Marxism, right, and there's a tremendous censure toward those ideas, right, that is kind of the obverse of, the success that Marxism is experiencing in the international domain, right? Of course, we have, all kinds of revolutionary activities going on all over, from, China to, Yugoslavia to Vietnam, and so on and so forth, right? And it's very instructive with respect to that period because, and I think, I was reading about one, there's so many pressures, right, imposed on thinkers. I was reading about one, I'm trying to remember his name, but he was a French historian, and he he had a positive assessment of Robespierre. And he was trying to get a job in the UK. He'd been writing about the revolution. And he was trying to get a job in the UK, and not a single university would hire him, in spite of like an otherwise fairly, impressive record, right? Because Robespierre had already sort of been deemed this kind of proto-totalitarian figure, right? But I just need to say here, it's interesting to me because, like, if you look at it really, if you're trying to do Marxist thought in the West in that time, you're going to be dependent upon some kind of Communist Party structure.
Right.
Right. So in France, like we know at their peak, like the PCF basically controlled, the Sorbonne, right, ENS, right. So they were able to, have a great influence on hiring in that context, right. And you can see the same thing in the Italian Communist Party. But in any event, what I mean to get through is that, what I mean to get across is that, and Kaufman obviously like really, really important to the Nietzsche rehabilitation, but in a way through this rehabilitation of Nietzsche, right, this idea that he's this kind of sensitive artiste, right, who is totally misinterpreted by the Nazis, right, this kind of thing, he becomes more fair game for appropriation than Marx, right, through that process. And it's interesting, right, because Lukács, rather polemically, like he'll be very derisive about this, right? So he even goes so far as to compare, the rehabilitation of Nietzsche to the rehabilitation of Nazi figures like Werner Brunbraun and so forth, right? It's like, this is just being dusted off, right? As we're seeing, Nazi generals who are now, working with NATO, right, to continue the same struggle, right, that Germany was engaged in, right, albeit in the name of the Allies more generally, right? So again, I was just trying to finish with respect to your question. I think that the great, like all of these, this was not the consensus that prevailed in the Eastern Bloc, obviously, right? And Lukács' work is reflective of that. So I think that, the great merit of what you're characterizing here as the Lukácsian tradition, which I suppose would, engulf Lasordo, though he does bring a lot more empirical data to it, is it alerts us to the essential political nature of the assessments and receptions of that period. And I think, whatever this is one of the things that bothers me about, the people who continue to avow this kind of left Nietzsche thing. It's like, I think that whatever your basic position on that period, I think having because Nietzsche was a kind of perspectivist, right? I think, like, so it's kind of ironic they oppose this, but I think being aware of the existence of those different perspectives, right, can be really, really useful, right, from whatever standpoint you're approaching the text, right?
What's your take on left Nietzscheanism in a post 2008 context? Like, say, putting aside this kind of, the arc of this post-war welfare state, Western left Nietzscheanism that's brought in during the Cold War Nietzscheanism. What do you see as the Nietzsche dynamics today in the contemporary?
Well, I think like power, like the idea of the will to power becomes a really significant axis upon which to frame extra class left demands.
Right? So you used that phrase when you wrote your article in my book, and I was really I really liked that phrase, extra class left. Can you define that? I mean, you didn't define it in the article, which is fine. I mean, I was left to piece together what I assumed you meant by it.
Yeah, and I'm sure.
But now that I have you, perhaps
with all your erudition, I'm sure you were correct. I'm here to flatter. I don't oppose the totalitarianism. This is the regime I support, so it's okay. I flatter you. Here we go. Actually, I'm surprised you didn't consider that as a name for your podcast.
Is that what I'm called? A totalitarian?
No, you're not.
I suppose. Yeah, my enemies love Hannah Arendt, so I'm not surprised.
Yeah,
but go ahead. What's the extra class left?
Yeah, what extra class left demand? So the way I would see this, like, I think that obviously in the 1970s and so forth, right? If you look at people like Foucault, right, like the precise generality of the notion of power relations, makes it a useful way to examine, oppressive structures within society, which may not fit into the binary of bourgeois and proletariat, right? And it's not to say that, like, the Marxist tradition hasn't had those, by the way, or hasn't had significant efforts to deal with that. I mean, we could look at Mao, we could look at the Forrest Johnson tendency, like that has existed. And I think that what you've had, I think one of the initial responses to that is you have, people like, Laclau and Mouffe, was this socialist, it was a hegemony and socialist strategy, right? This book from the 80s, right? That's very iconic. And, I think with people like that, the tendency is to kind of affirm, right? This, what I'm terming here, like extra class left demands, right? In the sense that they're like, we have to not ontologically foreground, bourgeoisie, proletariat, right? We have to kind of look at these distributed sites of struggle. We have to build this left that's capable of encompassing them, and so forth, right? And part of the reason that happens, right, is because, to be fair, right, I think there are different reasons why that's happening, right? Part of it has to do with, a more generic decline in the appeal of, Marxist parties throughout the West, and perhaps their failure to update themselves adequately with respect to certain social movements. But I mean, part of that very failure is theoretical, right? In the sense that the theoretical canon of Marxism had not arrived at a point, I would argue, or sufficiently able to address these things, right, within the lexicon of what Marxism was up to that point, right? So, it's like, and I will give you maybe a couple examples because that might help.
Please.
Yeah. One, I think, be social reproduction theory, right? Which is like, you have these kind of things like, in the, there's an attempt, like if you look at people like Lusarigre, right, to analyze sexism through the standpoint of commodity relations, right? But I think it's ultimately kind of a dead end, right? Because what's not being acknowledged here, right, is the organization of use values, as it were, right, in order to support the process of capitalist accumulation, right? Like unwaged activities that are performed within the family, right? So you have that kind of getting, when you have people like Dalla Costa and Federici, you have that kind of getting started in the 70s, right? You know, and it's responsive to this. You know, but it's almost like for lack of a well-defined, because it's not really until like at least Vogel and later that that really becomes ironed out, right, into a more meticulous theory. So it's almost like, you know, for lack of development of, you know, Marxist terms and definitions in this way, you know, there's a tendency to kind of say, well, that's just like power. That's just like, you know, to use it in that way. And but I like, you know, and another one would be the environment, right? By the way, and we've seen eco-socialism, right? And you had like even ecologists were part of the movement in '68, right? But again, I would argue that it's only been, you know, in the past, I don't know what it is, 20 years, right? That, you know, we've really approached a kind of mature eco-socialist analysis, and specifically with respect to, again, not totally disconnected from social reproduction theory, because if you read someone like Jason Moore, he's also looking, right, you know, outside of what is valorized, right? That is to say, like, you know, if you know, capital and the wage relation, right, is kind of like the visible part of the iceberg that we can see, right? There's all these things beneath it, right? You know, including, you know, the environment, which is treated as like an externality, right? Very often, not always, but like very often, right? Like you just take it, right? It doesn't have a tangible value in that sense. So, you know, but I think that this is just to say that I think that, so there was a reason that that happened, right? That was connected with the decline of political Marxism in the West in a certain way, also connected to certain omissions in these theories. But I also see the way that these terms like power, whatever, right, are often applied. You know, I see it as precisely ideological, right? You know, in the sense that it functions in the absence of a sufficiently elaborated materialist theory, right? And I think really now what you're seeing is like this process of catch up, where it's like, you know, decades later, and maybe it needed, you know, the energy, Marxism needed the energy breathed into it by the 2008 crisis, which I think brought a lot of people, maybe yourself, into the Marxist fold, to kind of finally approach the point, right, where we can say, no, we actually have tangible alternatives, right, to this kind of catch-all theory.
Okay, so let me recapitulate what you just said, because it's good, but I feel like for listeners it might be beneficial to do so. If I you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because a lot of what you said is super speculative. People might be immediately confused about how Nietzschean will to power fits in there. But what I understand you to say is that as we witness the decline in the efficacy and the coherence of Marxism as a true social critique, as not having a coherent conception of its own social ontology, as not having a connection to a clear commitment to a class emancipatory program, right? In the absence of the party. Nietzscheanism, and perhaps there's other philosophical systems that could fit in that vacuum or in that void. But Nietzscheanism, for reasons we talked about a moment ago, has become one of the most central, right, logics by which the left theorizes power. So let's focus on this question. Okay, so what one could glean from what you say here, Conrad, is that the Nietzschean theory of power is itself flawed, problematic, relativistic. It's grounded in this notion of perspectivism. Which, of course, when you say that, I always understand perspectivism to be one of Nietzsche's almost inescapable contributions, right? Like there's certain vulgarity, therefore, in anti-Nietzscheanism, because you can't really be anti-Nietzschean, because Nietzsche and Nietzscheanism is like shaped certain fundamental, like the conceptual apparatus of civilization, right? And I think perspectivism is a great example of this. However, with that said, there's a big difference in the political function of Nietzschean perspectivism, right? Which I think is kind of what you're getting at. And so could you say something more about how we need a more adequate theory grounded in a Marxist materialism of social power, of political power, perhaps, Because I don't want people to walk away thinking that like philosophers from, say, Deleuze to Judith Butler to Laclau and Mouffe, who are inspired by Nietzsche, right, in some way, are all garbage, or that their conceptions of power are fundamentally flawed. Although perhaps in some ways we do need to say that they are, right.
Well, I think they are.
They
Yeah,
are,
but
right? They are.
But that's the problem, right?
Right.
Like, and to give you a good example, like, I think the question is not, this is like the problem a lot of the time when you have these discussions is like, people want to retreat into the terrain that Marxism is most comfortable with, right? Like bourgeois proletariat, right? But I think the real challenge, is to, take some of these developments that have been made, right? And try to filter them through, a kind of Marxist set of terms, or reinterpret them in that way, right? So I give you a good example, like with Judith Butler, right? Where it's like, I think that in a lot of respects, because Butler will forever be known for this idea that, like, in a sense, biological sex would be a retroactive consequence of a social process of genderization, right? Which I think is funny, because I think a lot of people take that to mean like, biology does not exist, which I would not take to be the point she's actually making, right? It has to do with the different social classifications that can be imposed upon biology, right? And the flexibility that exists historically, which I think, we ought to acknowledge. But like, if you read Maya Gonzalez, like The Logic of Gender on this, right? She, and there are limitations to her essay, particularly insofar as it treats the capitalist mode of production sort of synchronically, in some sense, in a way that I think elides like a needed larger historical canvas. But part of what she shows here is the way that, the organization of gender as we understand it, owes to, basically the expansion of the wage relation, right? And then the designation, right, of women as people who perform sort of, I guess you would say, unwaged, extra market mediated activities, or like social reproductive labor, housework, we could say. But that she would reject the limitation of that term, but, in a very, very vulgar sense. So she agrees with Butler about, the kind of retroactive production of this biological reification, right? If there are only two, right? And like, you see this all over the world, right? Like, even when you go to Naples, right? It's like, they have like Feminelli, like they, and it's kind of funny when you go to Naples, Feminelli, it's like, I don't know how to say this, like, in a way that, because I don't like that's going to be like acceptable to everyone, based on my use of terms, but I don't know, you say like biological males that often attire themselves as women. I don't know how to say this. And some of them are even gangsters, but it's very funny when you go to Naples and you talk to people, because like their official line there is like, we hate, a lot of people say like, we hate LGBTQ plus internationalist ideology, but Feminelli, like, our weird gender category, like, that's okay, right? Because that's like part of our culture. But that's what I mean. And you see it in Southeast Asia and all kinds of places, right? That you have, or in Canadian Indigenous people, right? Like, these categories are not symmetrical with that. But again, I want to get back to the heart of your question, right? Which is maybe like, what is the political function of this, right? Like what political role has power played? I mean, I think that, and you even see it with Deleuze, where he flirts, and it's from Bernard Schmidt, but he flirts with this idea that, and it's underwritten by some of the Marxist economic sources he relies on, but he flirts with this idea that, finance capital can potentially reproduce itself indefinitely, right? Without experiencing, the crisis cycle, right? More characteristic of traditional capitalism, right? And, in that respect, he might have something in common with Alan Greenspan, who famously said, we're past recessions and this kind of thing, like right before 2008. But I mean, I think if I look at the overall relationship, so again, I stress that these terms emerged in a time where there was a political decline of Marxism in the West, and the whole appeal, I think, of the Soviet model, which is the basis of Eurocommunism and all that. And I think in that particular moment, they did have a certain utility, because it's what I said, right? Like, like the ontological use of power and these kind of other things. It was trying to compensate, I think, beyond whatever kind of cynical political motive there was. It was trying to compensate for absences and gaps within Marxist theory, right? I think what makes it different, if we're looking at 2008 and after, right, is the way that, I think that not just with respect to the fact that, a lot of these forecasts about, the way that capitalism had become, indefinitely self-perpetuating and crisis-free because of finance capital, where we're living in like a, an ideal world of, signifiers that bears no relation to, what Marx construed as material reality or whatever. I think that after 2008, economically, I think we see the need for a return to Marxism and Marxist theories. But I also think after 2008, it becomes increasingly clear that we have the tools to confront these issues that were previously dealt with, in a kind of impromptu manner, right? We can think the environment, we can think, feminism, we can think, all kinds of problematics like this, race, right? The trans problem, right? With slightly different degrees of efficacy, but I mean, very, very, there are a lot of interesting work on these subjects. But I think what's been more characteristic of the period since 2008 is like an actual ideological disavowal.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, that stuff's there, but they just won't read it. Right. And I think that what that really speaks to, and what one has to conclude that speaks to, right, is the fact that, a lot of these ideas, and I was having a discussion with Ray Brazier about this, and he said, like, I think it's valid to critique identity politics in a lot of respects, but let's not conclude that, it was always the case from the beginning that this was part of like, some buy-in with capitalism, right? But I think it speaks to what we can see in our time now, which is the level of complicity, right, of identity politics with the status quo, right? Where it's like, and it's like, honestly, like every single, right, like, like every war, for example, it's like, oh, we gotta attack China because they're homophobic or something, and it's like Afghanistan, it's feminism, right? And it's like, and you see this whole thing, right? I remember, I think there were people in the far right in the United States, and they edited The Little Mermaid, to make Ariel white,
right? Exactly.
and then this, it's kind of funny because like the far right were attacked for this, and then like a few weeks later on Twitter it surfaced and it was like, oh, China did this. It was complete bullshit. Right. But it was, so this is how it works, right? And I'm saying that, even imperialism now, right, very often it like, communicates completely within that register, right?
Yeah, like Israel goes to the International Criminal Court of Justice, and one of the first things they say is plead victims of online social media identity politics, right? Which is, yeah, so I mean, this is what I think Lukács already had a premonition of in Destruction of Reason when he said that, using Lenin's theory of imperialism, that the political value system of bourgeoisie kind of turns all of its political values, this is what he calls decadence, right? It's like this kind of crisis of the coherence of superstructure ideologies. So, and he always links that to imperialism, which I think is an interesting choice. Anyways, I think your point is very well taken. One of the things I like about your work, and I see this in your review of Toscano's new book, Late Fascism, is that you have the view, and correct me if I'm wrong, that one of the defining features of like Marxism, right, is that we have to have like a rigorous theoretical account that properly unites theory and practice, and that without that, we're vulnerable, like we're left out in the open, right? We're going to get mowed down or something like that as Marxists, right?
Yeah.
And I wonder if that thesis is that a correct characterization of your view? And then I think that a lot of people would say, well, gosh, Conrad, that sounds overly anti-intellectual, or rather, are you not relying on some kind of master theorist to sort of complete the system, right? Something like this. And I'm kind of torn on this question in the sense that, like, I actually think that, like, the sacrifices that Marx made in the development of his critique of political economy, right, over the decades of building and writing capital, actually did get close to achieving certain things. Like, he almost did get it right, almost perfectly in some ways. I mean, volume 3 ends on the section of the chapter called classes, and there's only like 2 pages, right? So
what is that Althusser says about that? He talks about that. He says we should remember what Marx said about this. He's like 40 lines, then silence. Right? This is like his, it's his opening, right? Which he uses to stress like the essentially incomplete nature. Maybe different than what you're saying, but the essentially.
But I mean, if you take like libidinal economy by Lyotard, right? You'll remember in that text, right? This is one of those kind of Nietzschean, let's bring a hammer to Marxism text, right?
Yeah.
He would call that, old man Marx. This obsession with completing the perfect totality, completing the perfect system, which can never happen. I read you as saying, actually, no, in fact, that is actually a task of contemporary Marxism, right? Which is why you're upset with Alberto Toscano, because you see his work as like probably of our generation getting the closest to touching something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately not achieving it, right? So I suppose I'll form it in the form of the question, like, is how do people respond to that position? How do you see that position? Is that a fair characterization of your view? And if that is true, like, what does that actually mean? Like, what does that mean practically for us as Marxists? Are we?
By the way, I wouldn't
please.
characterize myself as upset with Alberto Toscano, just to be clear. I think I was, very appreciative of Terms of Disorder. There were certain issues with late fascism, I thought, which seemed like it might have been written with some haste, but I never dismiss his how invaluable he is for Marxism as a whole. But with respect to your larger point here, yeah, I mean, I just like I think that again, like throughout throughout the history of Marxism, there's been this tendency, right? Because Marx had certain preoccupations that were quite defined, right, as a writer. He wrote Capital, which is thousands and thousands of pages, right? I think his mom once lamented that she wished he'd actually tried to make Capital rather than writing the book. But there's been a tendency throughout the history of Marxism, I think, to try to pair Marx with other kind of worldviews, right? And sometimes this even takes like in practical political terms. Sometimes this even takes like the French Communist Party was like Marx and Catholicism, right? But we can look at it throughout the history of theory, right? Marx and Freud, Marx and Nietzsche, right? Marx and phenomenology, right? And again, like I'm not against, right, some kind of synthesis, right? I've never advanced that position. But I think the real issue here is how does that synthesis function, right? Because the synthesis is not just this harmonious thing, right? Like we have to be proper Hegelians about this, like there's got to be a new foundation, which is produced, which is kind of self-consistent in a way. And that means there's going to be a decisive guiding element, right, within that. So, if you look at my book, Marxism Contra Subjectivity, I think that really what I'm trying to do is to look at developments that have occurred since 2007, right? So if you look at, speculative realism, for example, right? And then it's like, well, how do we interpret that, right? Because and we could talk about like all the different convictions of the different people who've had the name speculative realism attached to them. But at a very basic level, and to simplify, let's just talk about like ANT or something like actor network theory or object-oriented ontology or something like that, right? And it's like, well, these people are essentially making ontological claims, right? They're claiming that, the division between society, nature, dualism is outmoded, right? We have to acknowledge, the ontologically pluralistic character of reality. And it's like, that's not necessarily wrong, right? But that very standpoint has to be historicized, like to a far greater degree than what we would find in someone like Latour, right? And this is like the great merit of Moore and I think real abstraction coming through that, is he sees, because it's like the Greek thesis is not the same thing as like nature, right? Like that doesn't function the same way. So he sees like, the idea of nature as this global externality, right? As, being diffused and corresponding with the spread of the law of value, right? So you have, and in the thesis, I even use that to try to explain, the development of the notion of the person, right? Which to me is intimately connected with the expansion of the category of wage labor, right? Is it a coincidence that you have the French Revolution being waged on bourgeois principles, right? The universality of man, right? And then I think 2 years later, you have Mary Wollstonecraft, Vindication on the Rights of Women, our first feminist text, right? I think like 3 years later, you have the Haitian Revolution, right? So, it's really about, for me, it's really about taking that and sort of historicizing those terms in that way.
In other words, any supplementary philosophical, psychoanalytic methodology or worldview that is gleamed on to Marxism needs to be like historically situated. So say, for example, speculative realism, some of those authors took themselves to be Marxists, and even like Badiouians, right? Because I think that Alain Badiou's Being an Event was a text that initiated that turn. We could talk about that in a moment. So I agree with you on that point, that in other words, like, you need to have that, but you also need to ask the question, like, actually, what is being centered here? Is it Freudianism over Marxism? Is it Marxism and Freudianism?
No, exactly. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And I think that, in the case of, say, Deleuze and his the French Nietzschean moment, I mean, Deleuze very clearly says in the early 1960s that it is Nietzsche is primary, right? That's very established. I try to make the claim in my book, you may remember, that like Nietzsche is a sort of figure who can aid the class, who can sort of like be seen as a pugilistic figure to sort of build a certain class consciousness, in fact. But that argument is so different than the French Nietzscheanism we have been so indoctrinated into. It's hard to make that pivot. But there is a correlation between the rise of class consciousness and making that pivot, I insist. So I agree with you on that point. But although ultimately it begs the question, Conrad, which is what elements within Marxism need supplementation? Is it Marxist philosophy, theory of ontology? Is it aesthetics? Right? Does Marx have a proper aesthetics? Some argue that he does not. That's actually where Nietzscheanism, frankly, is fused. If you want to be technical about it, I would argue, is in aesthetics. For you, it seems that that in fact it is ontology and philosophy. It's epistemology. Say more about that, please.
Yeah. So you asked me which fields need to be expanded, and I would just say all of them. Because this is it. Like, we have to do everything, right? There has to be like a total way of understanding reality, right? And I realize that, even like allusions to totality may seem like unsavory to people in terms of maybe politics, maybe evocations of, over hasty or misguided applications of the dialectics of nature or something like that. But it's really just about, taking these core Marxist principles and expanding them, so that we can synthesize more and more of reality. Again, my book and, the importance you were talking earlier about, maybe I wouldn't describe it as upset, but maybe some of the frustrations I had with Toscano in that sense. And we've talked. I have an interview with him coming out in the forthcoming collection with 0 books on 15 years of speculative realism, which I think is really interesting because we're both quite lively, kind of sparring back and forth. He's like, that's a thorny question, that kind of thing when I ask stuff, right? But I took a great inspiration from his use of real abstraction, right, which he's getting from Sonrathel, right? And the basic idea there would be that if we look at ancient society, and I think this thesis is often misunderstood, but I think that if we look at ancient society, if we look at the idea that there exists, if you look at the Miletians, for example, like Thales would be like, all is water, right? Everything is like a composite of water. So if you look at this idea of a kind of arca, right? Aristotle calls it the arca, right? Or a kind of universal substance, right? The idea here is that there's a reason why this arises, and it's sort of a homologous argument, but there's a reason why this arises at the same time as you have this very bustling certainly not capitalism, but commodity economy in ancient Greece, right? And the invention of money, right? Around that same time, right? And keep in mind, ancient Greece, of course, also encompassed what today would be present day Western Turkey, right? Which is where Miletus actually was. And it's through that that he's going to argue that, the entire development of what we term abstract thought, right, which has to travel that pathway, right, to produce things like mathematics and like abstract mathematics, right, and geometry and so forth, right, is intimately connected with the spread of commodity exchange itself, right, in this context. Now, of course, when it comes to
it's such an awesome argument. If the book that Conrad's talking about is Intellectual Manual Labor by this German economist who actually was an economist right as the Nazis rose to power. And another text that Son Rachel wrote is a theory of German fascism and finance capitalism.
Yeah.
I forget the title of it, but we did a study group on it in my group called Class Unity. I can put a link to it. It's so excellent.
Yeah.
And anyways, but say more about this this Son Rachel text, and it's a wild, beautiful argument.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that, there are a number of misconceptions about it. So part of his argument here is that when you reach the stage of capitalism, right, that this fundamentally transforms itself, right? Because remember that, these kind of abstractions that were developed by the ancient Greeks, right, whatever utility they may have had for science, they didn't so readily extend themselves into the domain of practical quotidian reality, right? And we even see that with something like time, right? Because the Greeks, they have theoretically geometrized conceptions of time, right? But that doesn't become an actual basis for organizing capitalist society until the 15th century, I think, right? Basically the basis for organizing society until the late Middle Ages, I think, right? So, Son Rethel talks about, Galilean and Newtonian physics, right? In the way that, in how it conceptualizes the world, it's kind of like Euclideanism made real, right? That can be applied into 3D space, right? So, you have these principles that become actuated as scientific principles that can be extended, right, to actually apply them practically, right, into things like the organization of production, right? And then of course you have the work of Kant, which is where he begins the book, right? And I think the presentation there can be a little bit misleading sometimes, but so for example, if you look at Kant and the way that he looks at the transcendental aesthetic, right? And there's kind of this idea that he doesn't dissociate between pure physical space and Euclidean space, right? So I'm not sure if this is an example invoked by Son Rethel. He has a number of them, but that would be a case study of how a lot of these forms of abstract thought were deemed to be ahistorical features of the mind itself, right? And so he begins the book by essentially trying to excavate the categories a priori, right? And
exactly.
Saying,
so in other words, there's a material historical foothold, an origin point for what makes possible Kant's a priori form of knowledge. And that is found in the establishment of a common currency across many states, which incidentally is very close to Kojin Karatani's argument of isonomia and what makes possible speculative thought in Socrates. That the world system, right, that made philosophy in the West properly possible, was the material enactment of a common currency. And so Son Rachel puts a lot of emphasis on this in the act of exchange as producing that possibility. It's a fascinating argument, but one of the things you talk about in your book is really sort of, okay, cool, so this is his argument, but then how then is this actually, in a practical sense, going to be put to use in solving some of these questions about the division of labor? Right, and you say that he fetishizes manual laborers. in a certain way, or he renders them as authentic subjects in some sense. I want you to build to that. I want, I want you to sort of touch upon this kind of practical thing, if you could.
Well, what I actually say, what I actually say in the book is that there are a number of different indications that are provided, because one of the obvious, questions that we're confronted by, if we're going to say, and by the way, I want to quickly say that I think that you made one of these things, which I think can be a little bit of a misreading when you were talking about it, when you're like, well, you had money and then you had Kant, right? And I think it's really, really important when we talk about this, not that you said exactly that, but I think it's important to talk about the mediation of capitalism,
sure.
Right? Because, Kant's actually looking at, like Newtonian physics, for example, right? And the problem is that, like, it's like if you look at inertial motion, like that doesn't come from empirical observation, right? So then he kind of gets the categories out of this kind of analysis, right? But in other words, that requires the mediation of capitalism, right? To actually produce that, right? So there's no absolute and direct lineage, right? Even if in a sense, like money would be the nucleus, there's no absolute and direct lineage you can trace there. So I think that's important because, and again, it relates to the fact that he begins with talking about Kant, then he gets to money. I think it can muddle people's readings of the historical presentation in certain respects. But so what happens is that he gives, different kinds of indications with respect to what it would mean. Because one of the problems we're going to be confronted by, right, if we accept this idea, right, that there's this link between abstractions and commodity exchange and later the establishment of capitalism, is what do we do, right? Because this would suggest that like our most fundamental ways of thinking, right, are historical, right, and are somehow inextricable from impulses that, we may not find germane in terms of the establishment of communism or whatever, right? So what are we going to do about that? So, there's like a bunch of different.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by germane?
Well, how are we going to redefine our thought, right? And what, to get, because again, like, real abstraction, right? It's like commodity exchange is real, right? And yet it engenders abstractions, right? Which are, precisely non-physical in nature, right? So this has X value, for example, right? Which can be quantified in different ways, right? But you're not going to find that directly inscribed in the physical product, right? So, but the point is that if like the very means through which we think, right, is conditioned by commodity exchange and later by capitalism, because I insist you can't dispense with this category, right, then the question becomes, what do we do, right? Because this could become quite nihilistic very quickly, like, oh, there's no way out of this, whatever.
I like Zizek'ian, because in the sublime object of ideology, one of the most important footnotes, in my opinion, is precisely the one to Sanreto.
Yeah, and those are going to be important because if you go back and read Alberto Toscano, like Open Secret of Real Abstraction, he actually starts by discussing that as well. So that's one of the first things he brings up, right? Is the kind of mapping between Sanreto and Lacan that's going on there, right? So like, we have to kind of process this via the symbolic or whatever. But again, so the question is, what do we do, right? And there are different suggestions in the book. I think, one of the greatest issues with the book is the way that, he consistently appeals to this kind of physicalized world, as what will illuminate us, right? But then there are other parts of the book that are interesting. And, I think at one point he talks about how like nuclear physics, might be outstripping, right, the actual logic, right, that capitalism depends on for its continuance and things like this. And I think it's kind of interesting, like if you actually look at, the progress of the sciences, right, in this respect, right, because it's like, you have, for example, a reified notion of the external world, right, that is kind of posited by early sciences in a sense, right? But I think more and more as our sciences deepen, right, we become deeply aware of the independence of natural entities in some sense, right? They're interdependent, right? We could talk about climate science and all these things, right? Like mechanisms that run far deeper than we might have initially imagined, right? And ultimately, right, if we look via Darwin, right, the indivisibility of humans, right, from those same things, right? It would be maybe going a little bit far, but I think it would be also interesting to look at the fact that, and I do this in the book, and it was a few years ago, so I'm not sure if I can recount all the details, but I think it would be also interesting to look at, a lot of the presumptions of Newtonianism and the way that they make their way into Adam Smith, right, in a sort of harmonious and self-correcting, conception of the function of economics, right? And how, economics, obviously, but also physics, right, has been greatly transformed, right? So I think, just to say here, I think what's interesting is that, in a sense, it seems to me that if abstraction is the problem, abstraction would also be in some sense the solution, right?
Yeah, so that makes Toscano's intervention in the speculative realism ecosystem of philosophers almost like Feuerbachian for any Marxists. Like he hits a point of a materialism that the majority of them or whatever, couldn't acknowledge or see. But yet you call it an unfinished revolution that he opens. So could you recapitulate in succinct terms what precisely real abstraction upsets in speculative realism and object-oriented ontology, which for folks that aren't aware of it, maybe I'll put a nice link to an introduction to it so people can kind of learn about it, because I do think that it's like a very millennial thing. It was actually a blog. You know what I mean? I don't think that young people, I mean, I was in a debate with like these Haas adjacent young people, right? And I'm like, I studied with Alain Badiou, right? And I don't know, there was actually a lot of people watching the stream, right? And nobody knew who that was.
Yeah.
So can you kind of take us back and say, so we have this thing, speculative realism. How does real abstraction perform almost like this Marxist, let's call it scission on this philosophical project that kind of like dismantles it, but sends it in a different direction, maybe is one way to say it. Can you recapitulate that for us?
Sure. Well, so obviously real abstraction would be extremely radical, in the sense of challenging very basic presuppositions with respect to what we call epistemology, which should be obvious even based on what I was saying, right? Because it's not like you have this, capacity for cognition, which can be ahistorically conceived, right? Cognition as we know it has to be, in epistemology, has to be treated in historical and materialist terms. So I'm just going to put that there. But about the question with respect to speculative realism, so Toscano actually, there's of course speculative realism emerges out of this one-day conference or workshop that was held at Goldsmiths in April 2007. And Toscano, he actually co-organized and moderated that. And I think his interests were already turning like more toward Marxism, which may explain why he was offered but didn't appear at that conference. But then a couple of years later, there's a follow-up conference. I think it's in Bristol, I think, in 2009. And he has a critique of speculative realism at that conference, and specifically the work of Meillassoux, right? And if you look at his critique of Meillassoux, I mean, this could be kind of complicated, but if you look at his critique of
maybe you can just tell us sort of like what the basic theory of correlationism is, because if you don't understand that, then you won't understand the whole thing.
In speculative realism, you have the idea that the tendency within contemporary philosophy has been to understand perception as arising at the interstices of thought and being, right, in a way that forecloses our capacity to actually access being, right? And to make a long story short, the basic critique that Toscano has of Meillassoux, and I'm going to vulgarize quite a bit, but I'm just going to try to simplify it a little bit, is that, you know, he wants to access being, but the way that he conceives being is emphatically ontological, right? Rather than being more adherent with a kind of Marxist conception of that, right? You know, and also that he understands it as an essentially philocentric and rationalist process, right? It's like we're going to peer, right, into the ontological structure of being, right? And without reciting all the arguments, right? It's just to say that, you know, Toscano is going to foreground the importance of history and materialism and practice and all the things that we value as Marxists, right? And real abstraction is going to be an instrument for doing this, and in terms of his larger critique of speculative realism, because, you know, if you can argue that, you know, the Kantian categories a priori or dualism as we know it is in some sense, you know, the consequence of, you know, value and the way that it's played out historically, right? Then, you know, it's not just ancillary, like there has to be a materialist analysis, right? You would actually be eliding the core causality of the problem in that way, right? So basically this is it, right? I would stress that I think really at issue here is the way that, you know, turning away from, because you had all this like very, you know, the philosophical climate prior to 2007 was really saturated by like linguistic idealism, right? And we could, you know, and kind of like this kind of played out postdoctoralism, and we could maybe again analogize that to, you know, the abstraction which had been characteristic of finance capital, right? And that continued to be even after, right? But a lot of people kind of woke up to the issue after 2007, 2008. But the immediate tendency is to negate, you know, is to negate idealism, right? Linguistic idealism, correlationism, right? From the side of the ontological affirmation of being, right? And I think part of Toscano's project is to say that this is not sufficiently radical, right? You know, and this would be consistent with like when Marx and Engels talk about the limitations of like 18th century materialism, right? Like it hasn't yet congealed into like a real, you know, practical materialism in that sense, right?
That's why it's Marxism Contra Subjectivity. So that talk about where the subject goes, because a lot of Lacanian authors and even Lacan himself, if Alain Badiou's Being an Event somehow is one of the inspirations that ushered in this speculative realism moment, it's always a bit strange to think that, given that Alain Badiou puts a huge focus on subjectivity, right? I think his best text is Theory of the Subject, for example.
Yeah.
Could you say something about that, for example? Why is subjectivity? Why is there such a poverty of philosophical understanding of the subject in this historical moment of a post 2008 horizon? And of course, your book is sort of a clarion call for not a return to subjectivism, right? But perhaps more of a dialectical incorporation of subjectivity, which is seemingly missing. So perhaps sort of why is it missing? Where has the subject gone? I'm even thinking of that. What is it, that John Mouse song? I don't know if you know John Mouse, the experimental musician who was actually a student of Badiou. But he writes about that too. And I mean, this is a huge motif in postmodernism as well. So this is this sort of seeming idealism, right? Where is the subject there? I know this is a huge question, but perhaps you can kind of get at it in a general point and then drill down.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think like, you know, obviously there's a great, you know, because like in our society, and I think it's interesting, right? Because what's his name? Like this, I read his book. Like I read this like 800-page book. I don't remember the guy's name. He's like this, you know, this guy wrote this book that's like it's been getting a lot of like, it's the kind of thing you get at airports, but it's like about how the subject, like free will doesn't exist. Do you know this book?
Daniel Dennett?
No, it's not Dennett. It's like, wait.
Oh yeah, the Israeli philosopher that Zizek corresponds with.
Sapolsky.
Is that who you're talking about? Actually, I don't know who that is.
You know Robert Sapolsky. Yeah, he has this book that I read. I mean, shit, I can't remember anything tonight. But he has this book, Determined: A Science of Life Without Free Will. It's actually kind of an interesting. I mean, it's not a Marxist book, but it is kind of an interesting argument in it, right? Because he's like, his basic claim is there's so many things in our society, right, that are so much more determined than we're willing to acknowledge, right? And he's coming at it from the sciences, right? So he pays a lot of attention to like brain chemistry and these kind of things, right? But I mean, he also addresses the social level, right? A little bit. Again, he's not like a sociologist by training, so maybe a little bit more superficially. But I think to this end, like I think I was reading Thomas Piketty, and he says at one point that like in the United States, your likelihood of attending university is exactly the same as the wealth level of your family, right? And this is kind of what Sapolsky's objecting to, right? Like he's like, we condemn people for doing things which, like statistically, biochemically, whatever, right? Like are almost invariable, right? And we applaud people, right, for doing things that are equally invariable, right? And he's like, this is kind of like an absurd and patently kind of unscientific way, right, to inhabit our reality. But I think it just speaks to the ideological essentiality of like the notion of free will and the particular relationship it has to capitalism, right? Because of course, like when you have a systemically oppressive class system, which Russia does and America does and Brazil does and nearly everywhere does to a greater or lesser degree, right? It's of the utmost convenience, right? To be like, oh well, you failed, that's your fault, right? Oh, you didn't go to university, right? You didn't work hard enough, right? And just leave it at that, right? Let's not get into all the factors that subtend that, right? And so I think that kind of I think that we're in an interesting moment, because I think that you see on one hand like these like really because even if you look at like film and like like the absence of anything like social realism within like mainstream film today would be a good example, right?
So then the subject for you in a Marxist sense is inextricable from a theorization of, I mean, Marx has this notion that a lot of philosophers have gleaned from the thesis on Feuerbach, that what Marx's materialism is really about is a kind of theory of the trans individual, right? So it's not so much
Sure.
the Robinsonade, it's not so much the atomized subject, it's this subject of a social relationality.
Yeah.
And so what is it about late capitalism? Because I know you've been doing a lot of work on late capitalism, right?
Yeah.
That somehow, at least, as we theorize it, right? As the predominant theorists theorize it, why is the subject gone missing, right? Why is it so difficult to pinpoint its appearance in history, right? Or its novelty, this notion of Badiou in Logics of Worlds would have it that subjectivity makes an appearance into what he calls a world, right? They appear through the kind of maximal a maximal presentation of their existence, and they exceed the state of the situation, because for Badiou the state of the situation would be indifferent to what he calls militant subjects, and that's the only kind of subject that matters for Marxism, right? So Marxism for Badiou is like fundamentally an antinomian theory of the subject, which I always find really interesting, right? So what is the subject for you, right? Like, in a certain vulgar sense, you could say, yeah, well, it's the proletariat. Well, sure. Yeah. So, the proletariat's dead, so therefore the subject's dead. But it's not so simple.
I don't find that those terms have any utility, to be honest. Like, I really don't. And I think that...
Which ones?
Like subject, for example, I just don't see it as having utility. I mean, if we look at, we could look at the origin, and like Balibar has written about this, for example. Like, we could look at the origin of the term subject, and right, it's like the Greek, it comes from like the Greek hypokeimenon, right? Heidegger points this out, right? Like, it first has nothing to do with people, right? Like, it's very interesting, right? Because it's like, it starts out being like the the substance, if you will, that undergirds reality, right? And if you accept the thesis of real abstraction, this is very interesting because it would suggest that prior to, you know, the extensive commodification of labor power or wage labor, spread of that, that the subject precisely does not take on a humanized form, right? That's a later consequence, right? So like, you know, you can go through this, and then in ancient Rome, right, if I'm not mistaken, right, and you have the beginnings of it's is it subjectus and subjectum? I have to double check, but you have like the beginnings of like a partition between different conceptions of the subject, and of course this carries on into the modern period, in which we have, you know, on one hand a political subject, right, and on the other hand like a philosophical subject. Anyway, I want to stress like the deeply historically defined character of these terms. And I think, you know, if we think about the universal standpoint or the personified notion of the subject, I think, you know, to me, this is really a consequence of the wage relation and the way that it's spread. And that makes sense with respect to, you know, how different groups get lumped into this. So like, it's very interesting when we teach philosophy, right? Because we'll be like, the subject, the I, you know, and like we're sitting here like talking to a bunch of students, like this is just like any human, right? But it's like, you know, they're not talking about women, right? Like you do know that, right? Like, and a lot of other things too, probably excluded, right? For being honest. So again, I just don't understand the utility of those terms. And I think that when it comes to the historical subject or whatever you're talking about, like, I mean, I could go like as far as Jameson on something like this, and I could say like, well, you know, like it's not arbitrary that Marx says that of the proletariat. I mean, that's reflective of like a real economic situation in which the proletariat has a great importance. Does that mean that I think that's a useful term? Right? I mean, you know, like I think that ultimately, you know, it could also be a very obstructive term insofar as, you know, if we talk about China, for example, like Mao had to build a peasant first movement, you know, to have any shot at success. And we can comment on that, and we can say, as a Chinese Trotskyist like Wang Fengji would say, like that, you know, that led to certain long-term deformations of their movement or whatever. And I don't know, maybe it's true. The point is he had to do it because he wasn't going to win otherwise under those conditions, right? So I just wonder, right? I don't find those terms to be useful, but you know, even in the realm of this sort of political strategy, I wonder if it just doesn't lend itself to a kind of reification that isn't that productive. But I don't know. You studied with Badia. Maybe you have a more charitable view of that.
Well, for me, I mean, it's in a sense, it's reducible to, I think, the problem of radical democracy in a practical sense.
Yeah.
In the sense that the subjectivity that we are most familiar with is obviously the subject of the rights of man and a particular form of universalism, which Marx inserts himself, Marx and Engels insert themselves into in a particular historical sequence in which the kind of empty vessel of that subjectivity, right, that kind of possible emancipatory subjectivity that was exemplified by the Jacobin sight in the French Revolution, plays out a grand historical dialectic, right? So much so that one has to have a kind of Republican fidelity to the achievement of democratic rights only as a necessary passageway through to their overcoming, to their sublation. One of the maxims of Alain Badiou, of course, is that democracy today, radical democracy, a la Hartenegri, a la Leclau and Mouffe, is actually like a fundamentally flawed strategy for communist politics.
Yeah.
And he therefore proposes a different side of intervention, what he calls a subtractive politics, right?
Yeah.
Which I have critiqued time and again. I don't follow him in that line. if you're asking me how to define Badiou's theory of the subject, I will admit it's difficult to summarize it. In a certain way, you have to, I think, situate it in the long strain of French Cartesianism and Althusserian anti-humanism.
Yeah.
Although you've seen a curious movement in French thought, which I'm sure, like, Christopher Watkin and others have pointed out, in the wake of Meillassoux' intervention in After Finitude, which we mentioned earlier, there has actually been a paradoxical, if that's the right word, turn back to a revamped humanism. And even Badiou is making an homage to a new thinking of humanism and so on, right? So I'm not sure that I'm as committed to this abandonment of because I think when we abandon democracy, etc., when we abandon that long arc of the French revolutionary tradition of universalism on the side of political contestation and antagonism, that is also an abandoning of the class struggle, because I think Marx and Engels are always situating themselves, most often, some exceptions, on that terrain, on that political terrain, right? That doesn't mean that Marxism is necessarily reformist. No, Marxism is on the inside of socialist politics and all of its heterogeneity, as critics of it. As they are critics of the imminent movement of socialism. That's kind of the line of Platypus to a certain extent, I think, as well. I don't agree with so much of what they say, but I do agree with that general point. And I think that Althusserian anti-humanism gets off in the weeds in some ways. So I'm not as comfortable to abandon this theory of because if Marxism has a poverty, a deprivation of political Marxism, which I think we both agree that it does, how could one abandon the reconceptualization of the subject? I don't know. That doesn't make sense to me.
But it's not okay. So the way I would see this, right, is that, I think that from the moment the French Revolution is announced, like, it already sets off a process of reconsiderations with respect to, for instance, like, what a person is, right? And I think that, again, we see Heidi, the first colonial revolution, we see feminism, and so forth, right? In its modern form, right? Because you can always say there's like feminism avant la lettre, I mean, whatever, right? So the way I would see it is that the problem here has to do with the relationship between conceptions of personhood or conceptions of the subject and, I think, the category of wage labor as it's been historically defined, right? And this would have a great pertinence for American history, for example, right? In terms of, the function of the slave, right, versus the free labor, right? And how that corresponds to conceptions of raciality. And, I think that as our understanding of materialism and as our understanding of science deepens, I think that what becomes increasingly clear is that, again, we have all of these conditions with respect to the arrangement of use values, right? The conditioned capitalism, including the environment, right? And I think the real challenge of class struggle in that setting, right, is not, once we've accepted how deeply and inextricably intertwined humans are with our natural environments, for example, right? How do we forge a conception of class struggle that takes all of those axioms and variables into consideration? And I would worry, right, that if we use too strongly the language of the human, right, or if we use too strongly the language of the subject, that we lose sight of the essentially historical character of those terms, right, and the transformative nature of them with respect to history. But again, also what I think is like this broadened conception of capital accumulation, and now we talk about, like, well, we're in the age of the Anthropocene, for example, right, which would just speak to, to what extent the conditions of capital accumulation have engulfed and, endangered insofar as we know it, right? The world, right? So I would be very wary of any kind of, of course we can go back. Like these terms all have, like, you go to person, right? Like this is like personae, right? You can go to ancient Greece, right? It comes from the theater, right? And then it's used, I think, first in ancient Rome to establish the common link between the different elements of the Trinity, I believe, before it extends outward, right? So again, if these are just like, if these are religious terms, right? Like if that's the origin of them, right? Now I'm not going to say like undialectically that they haven't had a certain kind of historical use or that there's not like a mediation that was needed. But it's like, are we ready to acknowledge the immanence of humans to nature in that way, right?
Okay.
Which again is a question of capitalism and its structure, right? Like it's not just and I know that like this can sound kind of funny, right? Like I'm like, we should work with the whales, or like that's not what I'm saying, right? Like I'm just talking about the potentially outmoded nature of these terms with respect to the entire like material situation we find ourselves in, right?
That's fair enough. I just suppose that a political Marxism geared around a revamped commitment to political objectives, parties, programs, and the development of socialist education to achieve those aims needs a dose of a kind of framework for thinking the activation of collective subjectivity in a way that I think Marx pinpoints very well in the 1844 manuscripts, which is not something I think Althusser is wrong that the discovery of fetishism in capital somehow renders the radical humanist insights of that text superfluous. I think that's a wrong premonition, precisely because why else would Marx republish the Communist Manifesto in his later years, right? Like if that's a vulgar standpoint Marxism, right? Because I do think that it takes us back to, and I actually want your thoughts on this, like what are the shortcomings of Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, right? Because one could respond, and you probably would criticize this as sort of not adequate, but let's follow it and see what you think. Well, that the philosophical moment of idealism that Toscano intervenes in Speculative Realism in 2007 would need a healthy dose of Lukácsian dialectics from History and Class Consciousness to sort of reinsert the question of the subject, which is not a reassertion of a vulgar category of the person that is somehow retrograde from the 19th century per se. No, it doesn't have to be thought of in this way, because I don't think that's how Lukács thought about the subject. So two questions there. One is talk about the dialectic of the subject and the object in light of these points you make and Lukács, and then two, your thoughts on Althusserian anti-humanism, because Althusser is somebody that I feel like, even though I haven't finished your text yet, and I intend to, that you think we must go beyond, but yet his anti-humanism is correct for you. It is correct. Speak to that. What exactly in Althusser needs to be gone beyond, if it's not the humanism piece, and how is Lukács inadequate? Because I know that you think he is in some way, even though you respect his text. I know you do as well. Because again, I don't think that the Marxist Hegelian, or let's call it the left Hegelian theory of the subject, is this sort of vulgar category that's inert, that's kind of like from, like you said. But go on.
Well, we have different conceptualizations of it, so we'd have to, clarify what we're talking about. As for Lukács, so I guess the issue I have with History and Class Consciousness, which is not totally unlike, I think, the issues he had with it in his latter life, is that So Engels does this thing that I actually have amazing respect for. And what is the name of the Italian Marxist who later became right wing? Who writes about this? Anyway, so Engels, so if you look at Hegel, right? It's like, nature is recapitulated within, a conception of the totality, which can invariably be deemed, anthropocentric in some sense, right? Even as it may index to, logic or, human collectivity, just to simplify, right? But what I think that's really, really interesting about the dialectics of nature, whatever the shortcomings of those texts, it's the way that Engels he reconceptualizes the Hegelian totality as being nature itself, right? So when he's talking about natural processes, right? He talks about how, if you look at mathematics, or you look at, like, even Newton in a way, how it's in some sense like an abstract understanding, right, of how the natural world would function, right? And then he talks about how, thermodynamics, right, and like, developments in biology, right, and all of these kind of things, right, how they're actually beginning to produce, like, or evolution, it's like a really good one, right, how they're beginning to produce like a less abstract sense, right, of the world, right, and one that, leans away, right, from the notion of kind of man as imbued with this, abstract capacity to command and comprehend all of reality, right, into a far more immanent conception. So I think that's very powerful, right? And he frames this in terms of the progression of the bourgeois sciences, right? And I think that, to me, the issue with history and class consciousness, which is kind of like a shotgun marriage of like classical sociology and, Marxism. To me, the issue with history and class consciousness is the way that Lukács negates that, right? In a way that kind of reinstates this Hegelian analytic, right, of nature as a kind of, chafe or externality that's absorbed, by and through the dialectic in that way, which obviously for him, is linked to the conception of class struggle, right? But nevertheless. So again, lots of things to like about history and class consciousness. I think, it's like a great
But
flawed
let me
book.
ask you this: like, how, in a practical sense, for the cause of political Marxism, for the
Yeah.
for the um, for the realization of proletarian goals, right? For the possibility of a return to a political situation in which the working class is sort of once again a historical actor, right?
Yeah.
How can could you make the case for why we have to concern ourselves with these rigorous epistemological and ontological conceptions? You see my point? Like, in other words,
Yeah. Yeah.
was the success of the enfranchisement of Marxism during the Second
Yeah.
International period, after Engels wrote Dialectics of Nature before he died, and then opened up a whole giving sanction to the SPD to call themselves Marxists, and then Bernstein and Second
Yeah.
International Marxism then blossoms.
Yeah.
This is what we might call the peak of Marxism in a historical scene.
Yeah.
Clearly, I think we need to return to such a moment, right? Like we
Yeah.
think that philosophy can be a practical aid to
Yeah.
something like that achievement, right? Otherwise, I'm not sure exactly what we're doing. Do you agree with that? And if so, can you make a case for skeptics that would say, like, yeah, well, Lukács may not have had an adequate theory of the or support for Engelsian theory of nature, but what does it matter if he did or didn't? Like, what actually is the rub? Like, where does it matter?
Right. So arguably the biggest, like the easiest answer to that would be that, like, so a lot of the themes I've touched on here have to do with like the relationship between, I guess, humans and what we could call nature, albeit even within a context where we would historicize those very terms. So, you know, like the biggest problem we're facing now is like potential ecological wipeout, right? Like, so if you don't have like a serious theoretical response to that, now, I'm not saying that everybody in the world has to be like, you know, forensically reading Hegel, right? I do respect that, you know, dialectically, like moving forward, there's going to be a division of labor, you know, until such time as we get rid of it, of course, you know, communist utopia. Okay. But, you know, I do get that. So like, you know, I'm not saying that every militant, you know, has to have an intimate understanding of this stuff. I respect that people are going to commit themselves to different roles, right? And they have different interests and different capacities, right? So I certainly don't want to be pigeonholed into that kind of position, which I just think is untenable for very, very obvious reasons, right? But it's like, if we talk about the practical utility, I mean, I think, you know, we've seen historically, right? And it's funny, like you should talk about the Second International, because, you know, I think that a very, you know, not, you know, it depends who we're talking about, obviously. And like, you know, even Kautsky had some pretty astonishing insights, right? But I think one thing that you did see, you know, Bernstein and so forth, right, within the SPD, was that there was like a really vulgarized conception of Marxism that was often diffused throughout it, in terms of, you know, what Althusser will characterize as kind of like, you know, the simplification of the contradiction between labor and capital, right?
It was also very syncretic, and so it was not merely like let's find one kind of like Freud can solve the no, it was actually like a multiplicity of different forms of bourgeois science that would kind of be like latched onto Marxism, almost like a tapestry, you know?
Yeah.
And that's actually why you have like a little bit of Bergson, a little bit of Nietzsche, a little bit of William James, and, you know, you kind of throw all that together. And
yeah,
and it really actually, I mean, I've studied this quite a lot, especially in the United States. It really sort of, it did impact the praxis. In other words, it did impact the strategic direction in which the socialist movement and the working class movement decided to go, because the intellectual had a certain strategic position within that movement, right? And I think one of the interesting things about post 2008, right, is like we're not exactly sure where the intellectual fits in relationship to the movement.
Yeah.
Right. I wonder if you could comment on that, right? Because I'm prodding you to make the case. I mean, like,
I think a lot of the role, because like anyone can, you know, a good example of like how, because, you know, more so than even a lot of Marxists who, you know, may have written a kind of philosophy that we acclaim, you know, Lenin was a very committed intellectual, right? I think he spoke like 7 languages, right? You know, much of what he'd done throughout his life wasn't even, you know, a lot of it was not direct political activism, but was more like writing and organization oriented, right? And, you know, of course, Leninism becomes this doctrine that, you know, has a tremendous efficacy in reality, right? You know, and aspects of which are internalized by very large numbers of people, and in some sense made practical. Not to say there weren't certain trade-offs. But, you know, again, when I talk about, you know, one thing you see with Lenin, I think it's funny that you have like this charge of class reductionism. And sometimes people kind of yoke different things together, like in this kind of impressionistic imaginary. They're like Soviet Union, class reduction, right? And it's like Lenin was not that, right? Like he was breaking with that, right? Because there were so many simultaneous contradictions. That's what Althusser said. Suggests. going on in the USSR. Like he's writing essays on like how do we deal with the Muslims in Russia, right? Like we should, we shouldn't persecute them religiously, because this is a disaffected population and that's not going to go the right way. And really on so many issues. So, he really embraced the complexity and the depth of Marxism in that way, right? And yet he's absolutely emblematic of practice, right? And there's a reason, right? Because it's like, I think sometimes people think that, expounding like the most simplistic rendition of Marxism, that's what practice is, right? And it's like you're actually producing something abstract.
Why is that? Yeah, I see that so much today. It's an appeal to a vulgarized conception of the working class subject, okay, that presupposes that their supposed lack of education means that intellectual discourse must subordinate itself to that other who's lacking, right? And so first of all, that's actually like a false sociological claim, because like what we know about, say, the working class in the United States is that it's probably never been more educated than it is today.
Yeah.
And it's also pandering, right? There's like many problems I have with this presupposition, but it's like super common. And I would actually say, Conrad, that it comes out of like a liberal theory of activism, right? Which is this kind of like marketing theory of activism or something like this. It's so fundamentally anti-intellectual that it's a tragedy that Marxists would ever adopt that for themselves. So I know you agree with that, but like that's almost where we're at, though, in a certain way. You have to you have to adhere your discourse to that simplistic demand in order to move beyond it.
So like France is not as anti-intellectual when it comes to Marxism as the US. And I think it's like really interesting to ask why that would be the case. And we talked about the conditions of intellectual production for Marxist philosophy. Like, the PCF was able to, like actually have professors and everything, like Althusser would be one of them, right? That were, trying to develop Marxism in this way. But I think what you see in the US, right, is you see this basic rupture that happens in the 50s where, not only do you have, the after World War II, not only do you have the trade union movement becoming like highly conservative in a lot of respects, but you also see this rupture where, intellectuals are substantially dissuaded, right, because of all the, obstacles which are imposed, right, to pursuing Marxism in this serious way, right? So it really, really lends itself to, and that's not to say they relinquished like a generic concern for social justice or whatever it is, right? But it led to decades of like, the kinds of philosophy we're talking about, right? Which were, complex and maybe intellectually stimulating in certain respects, but that were more concerned with, maybe developing a doctrine that was appropriate for the emergent middle class, or, redefining the terrain in a non-Marxist way in some sense. And so I think that that's contributed, particularly in environments that didn't have communist parties that could actually incubate like the right kind of intellectualism, so to speak. I think that's contributed to a tremendous skepticism. But it's like, this is not a great, I think that one of the real issues with our discourse today, and like, I think it would be interesting to talk about, like, I don't know, Anna Kornbluh or something will say like, like we're in this immediatist world because we're just having like everything funneled to us via algorithms or something, which maybe is a little bit afield. But, I think that it's interesting now because I feel like, like I think Robert Pippin says like, the idea that you can have this direct apprehension, like intuitive apprehension of reality, like that is what all of German idealism is like critical of. Right. And, in a way, the relationship to Marxism would be a little bit more complicated, right? Because Marx, does take more seriously material reality, if you will, right? So there's a kind of dignity, right, one might have with respect to that. But the point is just to say that, I think that if you look at certain major strains of Marxism we can see right now. Like the whole movement is like anti-mediation, right? Where it's like, you know, if you stop and mediate, you're just like a bourgeois idiot, right?
What does
And I
mediate
think
mean exactly? What does mediate mean? Just so to define that.
well, like it might be
this,
more helpful to give you examples of what,
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
mediation is not. So like, it's like, if you look at, and the other day I was talking about, you know, like left deviation and right deviation, because I love doing this kind of, you know, Stalinist thing, you know, left deviation, right deviation. Okay. But, you know, I think if you look at like communization theory, for example, right? And which to me, you know, and I think Toscano points this out, or maybe, yeah, I think Toscano points out by Jameson, but like, it's like, to me, it's also, you know, part of the reason for the popularity of this stuff in the US is because you have this kind of disavowed settler colonial imaginary in the US, just like real libertarian kind of impulse. You know? But, you know, it's like, so if you look at communization theory, of course, this is the idea that, you know, like, we just need to go. Communism isn't a transition, right? It's just like, let's go, let's do it, right? And, you know, I guess the most sophisticated iteration of this would be like Theory Communiste, right? Precisely because it's historicized, right? So they're like, well, programmatism, you know, the party, this was relevant for like the Fordist era, but now like everyone is kind of proletarianized, and, you know, we're in the state of total capital subsumption. So, you know, like, I'm probably vulgarizing in some sense, but, you know, like we can go for it now. You know, I think that's the gist of it, right? You know, so that is exactly, and even Kornblum like talks about this as an example of a lack of mediation, but that is like exactly that kind of thing. And I think it's hilarious, like the thesis, because it's sort of like, if the left ever failed, it's because it wasn't left enough. And it's like, you know, it's like, oh, that was the problem. Shit.
right.
Like, no one figured that out. We just had to be more
Well, I
left.
mean, it is no shock. It is no shock that communization theory collapses anarchism and communism. I mean, there's no longer a schism, as I see it. Right? It's an insurrectionary communist impulse, which was extremely popular. I sort of see it somewhat in eclipse right now myself, given the failure of this kind of spontaneous insurrectionary impulse to actually like have material transformations in bourgeois institutions. Like that's the missing element.
Yeah, and
right?
I just like hate like every time, like, and I kind of loved it because just like, I think like the French Communist Party, they have like a spokesperson, because, you know, they have Fabien Roussel right now as the leader, and they just joined the Popular Front, right, in France,
Yeah.
with the Greens in the past. But like, I kind of loved it because they were talking about some of the riots in France, and like one of their people, he's like, yeah, he's like, some of the people, other parties, he's like, they have a strong tendency every single time one of these things breaks out to like label it to be this, like, you know, indicative of this, you know, potential for emancipatory change. And he's like, it's not. Like, you know, I mean, it might be indicative of a certain underlying social anxiety, right? That could potentially congeal into something more meaningful and organized, right? But like, it's not like every time people of a lower economic strata go and like burn down, you know, loot local businesses or burn down buildings in their own, you know, vicinity, that's like somehow an emancipatory expression, right? It's like profoundly misguided, and it's, you know, more indicative perhaps of, you know, a deficit of class struggle in the meaningful sense, you know, than a surplus of it, right? But yeah, so I think that's a good example of how that kind of immediatism perpetuates itself on the left. I think on the right, you know, and maybe you would know a bit more about this than I would because of like the conversations you've had with Haas and stuff like that. But I think on the right, like at the extreme, you have like this kind of mega communist thing, right?
You mean on the right of contemporary?
On the right of what we could conceivably construe as Marxism, which like some people might even contest the application of that term to it. But like,
Sure,
you know, whatever.
that
I'm
makes
in a
sense.
generous mood today. So, you know, but it's also based on like a notion of intuitive apprehension, right? Because the overall tendency here, as I would understand it, is to just kind of like, you know, reify even like the most desultory and kind of bourgeois traits, like of the proletariat.
Right.
You know, it's like, oh, the proletariat likes the family, and it's like, we just need to like defend the family. And it's like, you know, it's like no one bothers to go check and actually read like The Origin of Family, Private Property in the State by Engels, where he's like very, very clear, right, working off Morgan and so on, right? That like socialism, is going to arc toward like the abolition of the monogamy in family, which is intimately linked with, patriarchy and the oppression of women historically, right? And then it's no surprise that, I don't know like how active an element of his ideology this is today, but it's no surprise that someone like Has will end up talking about like Dugin or something, right? Because Dugin is a kind of, and of course later on it's very invested in Heideggerianism in some sense. But Dugin is a kind of like pure epistemic relativism, right? Or perspectivism in that way, right? So it's not, it no longer, like this would no longer be anchored in like, a larger rationalistic or materialistic arc with respect to our understanding of society, right? At that level, it would be like, the affirmation, right, of the proletariat as an essentially aesthetic category, right? And at that level, you're taking whatever it is, right? But it's like, but I think part of like people really need to understand this, like, and I think that, I wrote an essay about there's a Swedish director, right, Ruben Östlund, his movie Triangle of Sadness, and I compared it to Titanic because both are in some sense and to a greater or lesser degree influenced by Marxism. But I think Östlund was talking about this, and he was like, I made the movie The Square, and he was like, and Libération, which was founded by Serge Joly and Jean-Paul Sartre. They were like, oh, I'm this like bad person because like I portray poor people, in this way that isn't idyllic or something. They should all be like holding hands and singing Kumbaya or something, And he's like, I think that one thing that's really important about, Marx is that he doesn't, of course, like there's some kind of valorization of the working class who are often very poor in his time, more so than in a latter day context in which wealth was more substantially redistributed. But, it's like the reality is that there's all kinds of negative social pathologies, right? Which arise from, a lack of education. And I'm not, by the way, the US working class is more educated in the past, right? I'm also speaking globally, right? Like the person sewing a soccer ball behind a barbed wire fence in Bangladesh, right? To, the violence and the abuse, right?
Yeah.
Of those circumstances, right? To the stress, right?
Right.
And I think that, and it's not to say that, again, like we can't find like a latent emancipatory kernel, but it's like, this is like the proletariat is a category of mediation, right? Because we need the proletariat, right? But we need the proletariat ultimately so that it can abolish itself, right? Now, don't take this to be like, because I know that in your book, you're critical of people who just want to say, well, the proletariat's going to self-abolish. Like, I'm not saying that's going to happen tomorrow. And I totally understand and support what you say, right? About the need to build a kind of workers' culture, which like I think is true, right? But I'm saying that you also cannot lose sight, right, of the need for this internal transformation. But I want to stress here, let's look at Althusser, 1969, Forward to Capital, right? The Gamerian edition, right? And I think it's a really good, because I think he does a really good job, because I don't want to, when I talk about negative social pathologies and everything, of course, like, upper class people have negative traits as well, right? But, I think it's really interesting how Althusser frames this question, right? Because he says like, the problem with capital is he's like, it's very hard for people to read, right? He's like, because the issue is that the people who are most eligible to accept the contents of the book, right? Like often they it's a hard book to read. It's like 1,000 pages. It's dense, it's difficult. And keep in mind, he's talking about the educational level of the French working class in 1969, probably. Saying a lot of the time, the people for whom this book, who are going to accept this book, they're not able to absorb the density and the depth of it intellectually. But then he's like, but the people who are able to perform a more forensic analysis of it, a lot of the time they're ideologically blocked, right, from actually getting, right, to accepting the text, right? So there's going to be like a violent reaction where it's like, oh shit, right? If this is true, right, then I'm an exploiter, right? then my existence has been paid for and supported via exploitation, right? And that's going to force me into a position of moral dissonance if I don't arrest it, whereby I might actually have to change my life in some way that could be inconvenient or unpleasant to me, right?
Yeah. I mean, that I feel like that a lot of people forget that Marx peppers the strategy that Engels develops in his most widely read book, The Condition of the English Working Class, the early text that he wrote.
Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific is his most widely read book. But yes, continue.
Are you sure about that?
Yeah. The second most widely read, I think, historically after Manifesto. Yeah.
Well, what I have learned is that the condition of the working class in England was the most translated up to a certain point.
Okay.
And well, anyways, putting that's a thing we can.
I don't think anyone cares about this argument other than us, so I'm just
no. But I'm simply making a point, which is it remains a kind of mystery regarding how Marxism can usurp, let's call it like the contemporary liberal form of agitating the consciousness of the exploited, right?
Yeah.
I think it's led to a conception for a lot of Marxists in reaction to liberalism, because liberalism holds the view that like there's actually a hugely wide tent. Like we welcome all oppressions, we welcome and give home to all different forms of oppression. One of the problems that Marxism has is that they respond to that wide tent liberal activist model, let's call it, by saying no, all of those are subordinated to something more constant and more real, which is this form of exploitation, which if you read this book you will see in all of its glaring obviousness, right? And this is hidden to you because of commodity fetishism and so on and so forth. So I think you're right, but I also think that Marx also is working on that kind of nascent liberal activist model that Engels opens, and I don't even know if that's the right word for it, which is showing that the problem of real domination, not even abstract domination, is something that capitalism is absolutely. And of course, there's that Dickensian kind of historical context that Marx is writing about.
Yeah.
So there is that question, and I think that's interesting. And I do think that there is therefore a merit to this Leninist notion of the intellectual and the vanguard and all of that, which we can talk about at another time. But I mean, I guess to sort of wrap up our conversation here, I don't know. Like, I feel like we've covered a lot of interesting ground, and you've given us a little taste of your book, which, by the way, we will be hosting a symposium or a conference of some sort, inviting some very interesting Marxist thinkers to weigh in on your text when it comes out. Being published by Brill through Historical Materialism. Do you have a date for when it's going to be released?
I'm still waiting for the second round of editorial feedback, so I'm still waiting.
And then you'll get a date after that?
Well, I mean, I really like, I have to put this thing out or like I'm dead. So I think it's going to be out before, like, the latest should be November 2025, because that's when I wrap up my postdoc, because I live in Shanghai. And I want to finish it by then to be eligible to apply for jobs. So just a little careerism there. So that's the objective. So hopefully we can do that.
Well, we wish you the best of luck in that, comrade, for sure. And I feel like we're just touching the surface of your book. Maybe we need to have you on for a part 2 to delve into some of these things, because we didn't even talk about Lenin's materialism and imperial criticism, which is, I feel like, the text that can weave together a lot of the stuff we talked about earlier about real abstraction and the role of epistemology in Marxism. So it's like, but I guess to recapitulate where we started on this question of like immediacy and the kind of late capitalist intuition that a lot of Marxists have on the right, that the problem of the subject is not a problem. I would put it that way. Like for Haas, you know, there's a kind of there's an admission that the MAGA experience in America was a distinct, almost like phenomenological truth that only affected the working class, right? So he has, and this is tied into his theory that baristas are not proletarians, right?
Yeah.
And so
It
I mean,
seems
there's
to me that
obviously
it would be very questionable, even if you were to like apply it to whatever restricted definition it's supposed to have touched. But anyway, like if we look at data on that.
Right. And so it's a paradox to me, because like the right wing tendencies of contemporary online Marxism is driven by a post-leftism, right, which is in some kind of strange no man's land, I think largely caused by the vacuousness of the contemporary left. So you can't really, so maybe we can conclude on that. I know you've thought a lot about the state of the left, and I know that you have criticisms of the platypus position on the left is dead. But maybe you could say something about that, like where you fall on that question, and how you then diagnose, and this will be our final one, how you then diagnose, like what is the cause of the right wingization of like Zoomer Marxism? Like why is Zoomer Marxism going so right wing, seemingly?
Yeah, well, I don't like, I don't want to
If that makes sense.
I don't want to oversimplify, because I don't, to me, Zoomer Marxism is a kind of yet to come. And I do think that, Zoomers are, because of the direness of their kind of economic straits, like, because, the reality now is capitalism is basically running on like the last vestiges of inherited wealth that are being passed on from the baby boomers in lieu of meaningful redistribution. So I think there are like millennials now in the US are more likely to inherit a home than purchase one, right? So what that means is that absent, a greater degree of like some kind of political change in the US that would enable more opportunities for people, things are just going to get worse and worse, right? So, clearly everyone's circumstances are different, but I just meant to say that, in theory, right, and in the most general sense, like you being X number of years older than me, right, would be better than me, would be better than someone who's 22, like in this general trajectory, and discounting our actual personal stories, right? So, because I know you're.
No, but I do think that you're right to pinpoint the right wing end of Marxism, and I didn't mean to say that it's like driven by young people.
Yeah,
it's not, and because that would fall into like the Cotronist, like reduction of everything to generational politics, which I'm not signed up to. I'm not on board for that. But maybe you could speak to that.
Sure.
Because it is unique. I haven't seen right wing Marxism, as much of it in my lifetime as I have seen it at this moment.
Okay, sure. So like these are, so obviously like Marxism in general has expanded a great deal, right? Like I think like 70% of Zoomers in the US, or is it like people under 30? I don't know exactly what classification or whatever. They say like they're sympathetic to socialism, right? And then, like Jacobin is like the biggest, American socialist outlet since the Great Depression. And Bernie Sanders is like, I don't know, probably the most successful socialist presidential candidate in history, right? In terms of how close or not close, as the case may be, he came, right, to winning it all. So, particularly with respect to younger people, we have to at least contemplate the possibility that if we're looking at what you're describing as like right-wing deviations, that they're symptomatic simply of like a larger footprint. Because we could talk about, I guess it's a bit of a punchline that like Teen Vogue now is like to the left of Jacobin or whatever, which, maybe isn't always so difficult. I wouldn't see that as being representative for example, like a right-wing strand of Marxism, right? But like, I think that maybe a more, at least the way I would see it, right, is I think that what you see among Zoomers, I think you're seeing a bigger backlash towards the liberal status quo for like the obvious reason that it's been unable to substantively address these issues, right? And like every single like cause that's kind of co-opted by the Democratic Party is hollowed out of meaning in some sense. I mean, even they had Tarana Burke, who founded Me Too, right? And she was like, well, I kind of hoped that at some point this would like break out of this like purely retributive cycle, right, of just like naming and blaming people, and that it would become a discussion about more like systemic factors in society, of which from a Marxist standpoint, certainly socially reproductive labor would be very significant. But I think the point is that these movements can never touch on real causes, right? And we could talk about like Adolf Reed's comments on Black Lives Matter or whatever, right? But they remain within a kind of insulated, right, from an analysis of the material conditions that actually reproduce identitarian and oppressive designations in that way. So, and that's not to speak of all of like the cynical manipulation in terms of foreign affairs and the other things we talked about. So I think that what you're really seeing now is I think that you're seeing a backlash against the liberal status quo, right? And a backlash against, I suppose, what could be termed, political correctness. And I think that that takes different forms. But maybe it's not surprising that, when it comes to that rejection, which can certainly be channeled, into a very legitimate species of Marxist critique, right? That we also see like right-wing deviations, because people aren't that educated in Marxism in the US and in the culture at large, right? The dominant alternative, so it would seem, right, to, this sort of pallid, left liberal neoliberalism or whatever, right? The dominant thing which appears, is the right. Right. And I think it's important, like when you touched on this, when you talked about, the way people like see MAGA as this like, and it is true that for what it's worth, it is true that, Donald Trump kind of went around the Republican Party, that he mobilized a different, base, right, in order to win, than had been perhaps traditionally mobilized in certain respects, right? But it's also like, what is that base? Because I feel like even in Canada, we had the trucker protesters, and I think this became like, a big thing in the US. And it's like the people who came to protest those COVID regulations, like if you are just a wage laborer, like you can't just take the company truck and like drive to Ottawa. And like, so the people doing that are basically people who own their own trucks, right? Which would put them, you have to have quite a bit of money. Like if you look at these things, like $1 million, right? So it puts you more in the category of something like a small business owner, right? At that level, right? So they sort of repeat, right? The attribution, right? This kind of methodological fiction, if you will, right? That these people are representative of the masses generically conceived, right? And so on and so forth, without really doing the forensic work to actually ask yourself. And I think they did a similar thing with the Capitol Hill protesters, right? Like looking at the actual class backgrounds of people and being like, oh, right, these aren't really working class people, as it turns out.
I guess you could say the same. People have said the same thing, I guess, to your point on Adolf Reed and BLM, which is, BLM was predominantly white people standing in. I think to a certain extent that's a slightly cynical take, but there is some truth in that. Anyways, that is, you're touching on the problem of the petit bourgeois, which is essential. But I do think we should wrap. We've been going for a while.
Let me just say one more thing here, because I want to really get to this question, which I think is important. So
please.
I've been discussing a little bit on a theoretical level, the way that I think that, because like this would be what Jameson gets at, for example, like, the capitalism has become so complex, right? That, in a way, like, immediacy, right, is like the kind of backlash to that, like, the incomprehensibility, right, of the vastness of the relations that confront us. So what I think we need theoretically, I think that we need to embrace that complexity and really try to tackle it, right, as well as to distill it, right, in a way that's going to be accessible to people. And I take, the successes in the distillation of Leninism, which again is much more complicated in many respects than the kind of doctrines the SPD was diffusing, as proof that can be accomplished, right? That you can deal with Marxism in its complexity and renovate it and still make it something which is accessible and practicable, right? But you know what I want to say on the practical level, right? Because I think you've been kind of pressing me on this, and I stress that, you know, my book does touch on politics, but you know, first of all, it's like a philosophical reconstruction for the theory of Marxism. You know, boo, I'm sure the audience will say. But you know, but I want to stress this. I think one of the errors we make when we do politics, and you know, maybe this is something which has been said before, but I think it's really important to stress, is it's like half or more Americans like don't vote, right? And you know, it seems to me that, you know, even like if we're looking at people that have been activated, right, by the current political structure, right? And you know, if we're looking solely at kind of capturing, right, those kind of constituencies, like we're not going to win, right? You know, the real challenge I think is to look at, because I think the most profoundly dispossessed people, you know, I don't think you're likely to find them at, you know, a trucker rally. I don't think you're likely to find them at Capitol Hill, because I don't think that they fundamentally feel that their class interests are represented in any way, shape, or form, right, by the current political structure, right? So, you know, at the level of theory, we're tasked with negotiating this tremendously complex world system, right, which encompasses core and periphery, and semi-periphery, and ecology, and all this stuff, right? You know, production and consumption are geographically polarized, and all this, right? But at the level of something like a national and domestic political organization, and I'm very sympathetic at an international level to what Samir Amin said about the need for a fourth or a new international, right? Which I do think it's tragic, like, you know, the breakdown of international cooperation. I really think we need more dialogue, like between Marxists in different parts of the world.
Yeah.
But, you know, when it comes to something like a national and domestic political organization, I think the number one thing to understand is that, you know, you can't seek your solutions based on like a predefined notion of praxis, right? Or predefined ideology that is being supplied to you like by either, you know, the Democratic Party or the fucking Republican Party.
Can you rely on a theory of praxis from a historical analysis of past sequences of socialist politics that you assume have a matching relationship to our present?
Well, yeah, of course. Like, and you know, but the question here is going to be the level of symmetry, right? And I think, like, you know, so for example, like Maoism had a great plausibility in Vietnam or something, right? Like that's just true. But, you know, which is not to say that was the only thing they used, but it was very important for like Ho Chi Minh, right, to use Mao and all of that. Till later, and they got mad at China. But, you know, I think that, yes, and again, I think that like this is where I kind of see in the West, like, I think really the problem, you know, and I'm going to say like it's a certain absence of a Leninist analysis in a way, you know, because what's amazing about Lenin was, again, like when you look at the sheer complexity of the Russian society that he confronted, right, in terms of like, you know, the nouveau riche, like the old aristocracy, you know, like a small urban working class, like, you know, tributary peasants, like, well, it's just like, you know, this, you know, a liberal bourgeoisie, you know, it's a very, very complex class structure. And if you look at the way that he intervened into that, right, and, you know, even under the watchword, right, of working class hegemony, which, by the way, Gramsci did not invent, right? He defined it in his own way, but he wasn't the first to use the term. You know, he was able to put together, right, all these diverse class interests in this way, right? And so, you know, when you talk about liberalism and you know, the sort of diversity that it's captured, sure, though, like that turns out to be class specific in many respects, because a lot of the people who maybe, for example, are members of minorities, right, but aren't, you know, particularly elevated with respect to their economic level, like maybe they don't want to participate in that agenda to the same degree, right, for lack of meaningful practice, for lack of materialist emaciated analysis of things like racism and sexism. I think what we really, really need within the left, is to have the capacity to analyze all these contradictions, right? And build this kind of diverse coalition. And all the more so, because one of the interesting things is like, I think that there was a kind of tantalizing appeal, right? In like, past decades or post-war, let's say, right? Or mid-century, we could say, because like when America was still a nation of production, right? It was very easy to entertain this idea that like, well, the Soviet Union had this sort of impromptu ad hoc strategy they developed, but we're like a real manufacturing country, right? So we can just go with the working class, right? Now that didn't succeed for a range of reasons. And this is like discussed in the 1920s, like Jay Lovestone, like American Exception. You have all these debates about this, which are historical in the US. But it's all the more relevant in the US today, precisely because so much production has been outsourced. Right? So in a way, we end up like in the same position where it's like, well, how do we base a movement on the proletariat if the proletariat, is not the majority, right? Or is not, decisive with respect to the totality of the population? And I think looking at Lenin can be very useful, right, in terms of how he deploys hegemony for understanding that.
No, that's really good. Yeah. That's really good. No, it's a good way to end. I might have to clip that little thing and put it at the very beginning to give our listeners a taste of this wide-ranging conversation. Thanks for coming on my show. Your first time. I certainly learned a lot. I'm gaining a lot from your book, and I hope that it comes out as soon as possible for your survival, as you mentioned, but also because for the cause of emancipatory knowledge, which I think Marxism is about that. CLR James would always say that the answer is found in spreading Marxist knowledge. And so I think there's a lot of truth to that. I still have many questions for you. So either we'll have to do this on DMs or we can just make it public and do this again, which would be fun. Wish you the best with your writing and research and all of that. And please come back and join us again.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks. Daniel. Appreciate that.